Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we're in Masechtas Nedarim, Daf Beis. We're starting a new Masechta. Kol kinoi Nedarim ki Nedarim. So when it comes to a kinoi, which is like a slang phrase, regarding a neder that one makes, it has the same status as a neder. So let's go into the Ran. He says as follows. Neder hu echad mishnei inyanim. A neder is one of two matters. Im nidre hektish, where we're referring to making a neder regarding something of hektish, shu makdish l'bedek abayas, ol mizbeach, that you're being makdish something, you're designating it, that it should go to the bedek abayas for the temple upkeep, or for the bringing, let's say, an animal on a mizbeach. Well, inyan zeh, enu yochol hakdish el mashehu shaloi. We know that you can only be makdish something which you own. The isur koilel kol adam, and the isur goes upon all people. Namely, that once you're makdish something, not only can you not use it, no one is able to use it. It goes to the base of mikdash. Oh, nidre isur. Let's say we're dealing with something which is asur, she'asur al atzma devarim hamutarim. There's something which is really permissible, but you make a neder. I'm not going to allow such and such a thing. I'm not going to eat such and such a thing. Now, ve'inyan zeh yochel aser afil nichsei chavera yelav. You can even aser your friend's objects. It's not necessary that it has to be yours. Ve'in isur shavel kol. It's not equal to everyone because it's only aser to me, but not everyone else. So those are a couple of distinctions between various types of nedarim. Being neder of hek to hektish, or just stam to asir something on yourself. Masechta zu, he be'inyan nidri iser. This is referring to asering yourself. Shema sheshana kan charamim. Shema sheshana kan charamim kacharamim. When it mentions charamim, hainu mishum shaloshan chayrim kashem shehu koil chermi bedek abayis kachu koil nidri iser. So it's just comparing the two, skipping a few lines in the Ran. V'nidre iser him be'echem mishloisha derachim. When it comes to a neder, to aser something, the Ran says there's actually one of three ways. Iker haneder, v'kinoi v'yadois. So what is each one? The Ran explains. Iker haneder hu she omer davar zeh aser lai. You say that this thing is forbidden to me. Uvein shehitfisu b'davar acher, whether you're little being typhus, you're grabbing onto something else, that this should be like this, ben shelo hitfisu, whether you're not saying this should be also like this, zeu neder ha'omer b'Torah. This is a neder in the Torah, skipping a few lines, second wide line. Hilchach, therefore, heicha shehitfis. Let's say you do this item, you say that I'm grabbing onto something else, this should be like this, you're mahari kikar zel like a carbon. You say that this bread, which in itself is mutter, but you're making it usher to yourself, and you're saying, just like this carbon is usher to me, so to this piece of bread, chayil nidre, so the neder is chal, the ikar neder huzeh, and that is considered to be ikar neder. So there's also then the kinoi. Now, kinoi, as we said, is using a slang phrase. Hu shiba makom carbon. Instead of saying that this bread will be carbon, you use some other slang. Yomer koinim, konach, koinim, b'chol she'omer kain harihi, harihu aser ki'il omer carbon. Olai kikar. It's the same thing as you saying carbon, because these are just slang words for the word carbon. So that's what a kinoi is. Kikar is hainu ditnan kol kini nedarim kinedarim. So now we can understand the very beginning of this Masechta that says that all slang words that you use, let's say, instead of the word carbon to aser this bread, is just like if you would have said the ikar haneder, that you would have said hari kikar zel like a hari kikar zel like a carbon. Bahani kinuyin plig Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. The Gemara. We're going to see in Machlokas Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lashon Nachrim Heim. According to Rabbi Yochanan, he says that this is Lashon Nachrim. The other languages actually mean this, but the word carbon is basically translated into other languages. So you're using the word, let's say, sacrifice. Hari kikar zelai, kiss sacrifice. Reish Lakish Amar Lashon Shabadu Lahem Chachamim Li'os Nedarim Bo. These are like almost like made up words. So it's a machlokas whether it's an actual word, let's say in a different language, or these kinuyim are made up words. Rav Yochanan the Lashon Nedarim Heim, that they actually came from another language. Vadei hanoida behem kanoida beikar carbon shenedarim hamurim heim b'chol lashon. You can make a neder in any language. So according to him, it makes sense that if you use a kinoi, that kinoi nedarim and kinedarim, because it's the same thing. It's just you're just saying it in a different language. If you feel Reish Lakish that said these are made up words, skipping a line, Shari kol halashanas einon ella haskamas uma, that the whole notion of a language, it's just people admit this is what's an apple, this is what's called water. These are different words. Manzana or agua, mayim, tapuach. So these are just words, these are just sounds that you can say that the language itself is just like made up funny sounds which have no real meaning necessarily. So v'logara hasmachas chachamim. So therefore it's no different than when the chachamim use these words. It shouldn't have any difference. Zal. Mahaskamasam. Hilkach haviluhu midaraisa. So these are like real nedarim. And now you skip a few more lines. It says v'hanachin shiri'isi b'zeh who Mashi Perish Hachacham Hagadol Rabbi Yehuda Bar Chisdoi Zal Durabusa Shmi'inon. It teaches us a chiddush. Lo miboy b'lashanis nachrim. Not only when it comes to using other languages, shehem lashanos gemur, that they're real languages. Shanoid behem neder, that it's a real neder. Shafil b'lashanos she'enim gemurim. Even languages which are not really established. And the world, okay, this is Spanish, right? Kagon elu de kainim kainach shahari lashon hakoideshu, they are lashon hakodesh, el lashon ishtabish, they're kind of like mixed up words. V'salchadat ramina shanoida behen lo yehi neder. You would think maybe that type of a kino isn't good. Kivan she'enon lashon gomer, b'fnei atzmo, it's not really a language. Kamash one, kivan she'anachrim, medabrim behem. Other languages, they speak this way. It's still considered to be like a neder gomer. V'yados. So what are yados, which is like an incomplete phrase? So this, the Ran says, v'yados nedarim hu shemaschil b'mixas diburo shel neder. You began the words. El shenu gomer oiso. You didn't complete it. V'oiso mixas adibur. That partial. Havi ilu neder kol shlamos hadibur. It's like you said the whole thing. Ka'adam ha'eches kli b'beisiyad, like you're holding a vessel with the handle. Shlo umataltul kulo. Once you hold the handle, the whole thing moves, and therefore mishum hachi chayil nidra. Even though it's true that you're only holding part of it, nonetheless it's still fine. So therefore, that's what it means. Kol kini nedarim kinedarim. And we saw a lot of Ran, but this is the beginning of this Masechta. It was important to be able to establish what is considered to be ikar and neder. Again, the la'aser. So he said it's, if a verse says hari kikar zel like a carbon, and a kinoi, or all these other variations of the word carbon. So he said that also works. And it's seemingly double portion by according to Rav Yochanan, because that's just another language. But even according to Reish Lakish. Question 5. Rav Yochanan the Amar kinuyim lashon nachem heim maishna de pirish hanach lishani kainam kainach kainas tfei mishar lishni. How is that different? So he says Ravus Ashmi'inan, which is what the Ran. A lot of these questions are straight Ran. Ravus Ashmi'inan the afal pi she'in heim lashonos gemurim. They're not really languages. Ela shibush lashon hakodesh. Again, they're just like ways of jumbling around the lashon hakodesh. Sakadat lemina the lo yehi hanoida behem neser. You think it wouldn't work? Kamash b'lon. Okay, that was question 5. So let's continue in the Mishnah. The charamim kecharamim. What is that? Says Rashi. Kolomer she'omer nechasim elu. These possessions of cherek, chenek, cheref. So you're using these other languages again, which is a kinoi, like a slang phrase. Hari elu ki'il omert, as though you actually said the right words. The chasim elu olav cherem, vehem asirim olav. That you use the word cherem, which is the proper language. So even if you use other variations, so that kinoi also work. So first we mentioned Nedarim, then we mentioned Charamim, and Ushvuos Keshvuos. So we're going to see, again, when it comes to making a Shvua, some type of an oath, we'll discuss what's the difference between a Neder and a Shvua soon. So again, the Kinui also works as though you said the Ikar HaShvua. When Naziris K'Naziris, again, is the same thing. If a person says, the Ran says, Hareini Nazik Pakiach, Koloimer Hareini Nazir. It's the same thing as saying Hareini Nazir. Okay, fine. So the Mishnah began talking about Kinuyim. And then it says, Ha'omer Chavero. If a person says to his friend, Mudrani Mimcha, making a nether against you, Mefroshani Mimcha, I'm separating myself from you, Merchakani, again, distancing myself, Mimcha, Sha'ani Oichelacha, that I eat from you, Shani Taimacha, to taste anything. So din is Aser. In that situation, it is Aser. So if you look in the Ran, which is kind of interesting. Mishnah doesn't even mention Yadais, which, as we said, is an incomplete phrase, but it was talking about Kinuyim, and then all of a sudden it starts explaining Yadais. That's what it is. So continue with the Ran. Vahavi Yadais mishum deloi masik dibura lamemer kikarbon, because you didn't complete and say kikarbon. You didn't finish the phrase. It doesn't mention kikarbon. Menuda nilacha. Whenever a person uses the language of menudani, which is again of excommunicating yourself, separating yourself, he was actually chaychech, which means he was unsure lahachmer, and he ended up going strict. It says Rashi, havi mechachech lahachmer, diaser namu in neder hu v'loi barule. So if he says something which is not so clear, besafik, we say, you know what, maybe in fact, we should be going strict. Okay, so again, we saw question 2. All right, let's continue with Beis Amud Beis, the Gemara. So the Mishnah said, "Kol kinui nedarim kinedarim." So when it came to nedarim, even if a person uses a kinui, uses a slang phrase, it's kinui like you said the word carbon. So ma'ishna gabi nazir d'lo katanilhu lukuhu. If we see the next Masechta's Nazir, it doesn't mention Nedarim, it mentions Nazir, but it doesn't talk about Neder, Charamim, Shvuos. So Ma'ishna Gami Nedarim, the Ketani Luku, says the Ran. Kaloim Rabbi Il Masechta's Nazir, Lotana, Elo Kol Kinu Naziris Kinazirus. So it's almost a repetition, the beginning of Masechta's Nazir to the beginning of Masechta's Nedarim here, which not only does it, but over here it doesn't only mention Nedarim, it talks about Nazir also. So wouldn't it make sense that Masechta's Nazir should also mention Nedarim? So what's the difference? So Gemara says like this, Mishum, the Neder Shvu Ksibi Gabi Hadadi. We mention Neder over here together and also Shvua because they're really mentioned together. They're mentioned near one another. Says Rashi, Kol Neder v'chol Shvuos Iser. So since the pasuk says them both together, therefore it makes sense that we should just couple them together in the same Mishnah. Okay, so the Gemara says, okay, I understand that. So Tani Tartin, so we're going to mention 2, the Kivanda Tani Tartin, Tani Lakuhu. Since we mentioned 2, so we really had no need to mention Charamim or Nazir, but once we mentioned Neder and Shvuos, which is 2, so we decided to bring the other 2 in. Which again, normally that's not how it works. Usually you'll bring in, we'll say my Shai High Shire, we'll mention, maybe you should mention all 4. So that's the point. If you only mention 3, so then it can't be you're just going to exclude 1. So therefore you would either mention 2 or you would mention them all. Velisni Kinoi Shvuos Baster Nedarim. So why don't we say the Kinoi Shvuos after Nedarim? In other words, why does our Mishnah say that we go from Neder, Charamim, and then Shvuos? If Neder and Shvuos are the 2 ones which are next to each other, then write them next to each other in the Mishnah. Why is Charamim in between? So that's the Gemara's question. Listening Kinoi Shvuos Boston Nedarim. That makes more sense. So I did the Tan Nedarim. So obviously we're in the Masechtas Nedarim. So we mentioned Nedarim first. So the Mitzer Cheptzeleha. When it comes to Nedarim, the Iker difference between Nedarim and Shvuos is this. when it comes to a neder, you're answering the object on yourself. So Tananami Charamim de Mitzar Cheftzaleh. So that's also a Charamim are. They're also answering the object on you. Lafuki Shvua de Ka'aser Nafshe min Cheftza. Here it says, I will not eat. It's not on the object, it's on the Gavra. So that is a major distinction. So even though Nedarim and Shavuos are written together, but Neder and Charamim share the characteristic that they both aser the Chefetz, but when it comes to Shavua, you're asering, it's on yourself. You're asering yourself on the upon the thing. So it's different in that way. So question 6a, Ma chiluk bein lashon nedarim lashon shvuos. So nedarim mitzer cheftzoleh, shvuos aser nafshi mecheftzol. Straight answer. So the Gemara says, so pasach bekinuyin. So you began talking about kinuyim, kol kinui nedarim, etc. So it talks about kinuyim, about the slang language, and then all of a sudden, even though it says kol kinui nedarim, mefarshi yadais. Then all of a sudden it starts talking about yados, incomplete sentences. Which didn't mention carbon. Doesn't make any sense. Why would you start? We didn't even mention this at all. So yados, when it comes to yados, inshi ayri behoin, is it even mentioned? The Mishnah never mentioned yados at all. So why all of a sudden is it being thrown in over here? It's hard to understand this. So that's Gemara's question. You said you're right. You have to. There's words missing in our Mishnah. You're supposed to read kol kini nedarim kinedarim be yados nedarim kinedarim. So you have to do. You do need to throw in the element of yados in there as well. Okay. So let's hold off for a second. Let's look at the Ran. It says v'lo neder b'loshen shvua hilkach kol shehichlif shel zeh b'zeh ein b'davar k'lam. Okay. So we know that when it comes to a neder, you cannot say b'loshen shvua, and a shvua can't be said b'loshen neder. Okay. Fine. If we skipped all the way down somewhere halfway through the Ran, Avol haramban zal kasav b'hilchas nedarim shelo. The Ramban says the leika lishbushi hanach sugya l'meir merdula daiki b'lishinaihu elvade neder she'omer b'loshen shvua. When you have a neder that's said in the language of a shvua b'loshen neder mahani. The Ramban says that it actually does work. Mihu la meikar neder v'ikar shvua elwa medin yodaisu de mahani. So it's interesting. If you say neder b'loshen shvua, shvua b'loshen neder, the Ramban says it works, but not meikar neder, but because of a din of yadais. It's no different or no worse than an incomplete sentence. The neder she'omer b'loshen shvua kivan de piv v'libo shavin, since your mouth and your heart are the same. Aser shvua al atzmoi, or it says on the side, but neder al atzmo. Alpha bi shlo yomer b'loshen medukduk, even though you didn't say it the exact correct way. Yad miyahavi. So the Ramban says it should still be yad. V'chein b'shvua shemer shvua kikr zel lai. Now again, the notion of olai is upon me, right? Which we're saying shvua kikr zel lai. Kivan shepiv libo shavin l'asar chilas mikikr zel b'shvua mehani medin yad. Ela the sugin the hachad v'ikr loshen neder v'ikr loshen shvua amrinan. So this is question 6b. Masvar demand the Amr the neder b'loshen shvua aser. Why would you say it works? And the answer is because, again, since pivali bo shavin, it should be aser the din yadais. Alpha be shlo yomer b'loshen medukduk. Nonetheless, it would aser. So the Ran brings down the Ramban. That again explains that the din still is that it would aser, even if you didn't say the correct lashon, it should still work out a din yad. Let's go back to the Gemara. So v'lifurush kinuin bereisha. So understand, it talks about kinuyim, and then fine, we'll add yadais, and then we explain yadais. But wouldn't it make sense? You mentioned kinui first, so you should explain the kinuyim first. Why do you mention yados second, and then all of a sudden you explain yados first? The truth is that's how the Gemara works often. Hahu de salk mine, hahu mafarsh bereisha. However they ended off, That's how one that they explain, because once you mention it, it continues. We find this in many places. So it says, what do we use to light for Shabbos candles and whatnot? So ein madlikin almost says not. So it's because the ein madlikin is first. It is mentioned first, is explained first, rather, even though it's mentioned last. So also when it comes to the dinim of hatmana, of whether or not that parak is talking about hatmana or shehiyah, that's a whole gemara over there with Chananya. But the point is about insulating pots. Let's keep it simple. So it first mentions there's certain things you could be taimnin, and some things you can't. Ein taimnin b'chulu. Okay, all right. So fine. Again, it's the same proof. Chulu. B'met isha yatsa b'mayina ena yatsa lo teitzi isha. So there's certain things that a woman cannot go out with. Depending, it can come off. She'll end up carrying it. If it's loose, etc. It's totally with a chatzitza for the mikveh. So, but again, we see that it mentions second what she should not go out with, and it explains that. And we find this elsewhere as well. It's interesting. It doesn't bring the Gemara in Brachos, which talks about the very first daf in Masechtas Brachos in Shas, that talks about Kriya Shema Shel Arvit. Then it talks about Kriya Shema Shel Shachris, and then it explains Shachris first. That's what the Gemara over there says. The whole heichot. So we see that that's the pattern. So that's why over here we explain the others first. The whole heichot of pasuk lo mafarshim b'reisha. Is that true? But non yesh neichot manchilin. There's sometimes that people can inherit, and they can also cause others to inherit. Neichot lo manchilin. Ve'elu neichot manchilin. So what do? We first explain the ones that the first thing that was mentioned. Yesh mutaros l'balehen v'asuros li'avamehen. So we had this not too long ago. There's a very lengthy Mishnah, which a lot of it was repetitious, which is what Taisus over there can ask. Yesh mutaros l'balehen. There's certain times she's mutter to her husband, she's usher to her. So if her husband dies, she cannot do yibum. Obviously, depending who she may be related somehow to the yavam, or maybe it's a kohen gadol. Sometimes mutaros li'avamehem v'asuros l'balehen, the elushim mutaros l'balehen v'asuros li'avamehem. So again, it explains the first one first. Yesh te'uno shemen l'vayna. There's certain things that require te'una shemen and l'vayna, oil and frankincense. Yesh te'unos hagasha. Some require hagasha, bringing it close. Ein tunos tenufa, which is Masechtas Menachos. Tenufa l'hagasha v'el tunos hagasha. So we look in the Ran. He says, "Mutaros l'balhein." Okay, yeah. So the Ran actually brings us down and says, "Yesh mutaros kohen hedget shenasa salmana." We have a regular kohen who married a widow. Yesh lo ach kohen gadol, so she can't marry the kohen gadol for yibum. And the other way around, kohen gadol shekidish as almana. That is Aser, a kohen gadol cannot marry a widow. The yeshlo es kohen ach kohen hedget, so she can marry him. Okay, so it says there's certain things that require shem and levina. So it's brought down in Masechtas Menachos, such as minchas asoyos umachvas umarcheshes. Some things require oil and not frankincense, such as minchas nesachim. Some require hagasha. Shiyagish kohen es a mincha bekeren droimus maravis, that they have to bring, the kohen has to bring the mincha to the southwestern corner, as the pasuk says, Zois taras a mincha hakrev oisa. Okay. Weiter. Yesh bechor l'nachla ve'in bechor l'koyin, bechor l'koyin ve'in bechor l'nachla. So you could maybe be a firstborn regarding pishnayim, but not necessarily regarding the din of having to give the Kohen the 5 sloim for Pedin Aben. Vezu b'chor l'nachla ve'ein b'chor l'koyin. Fine. So the question is, sometimes the Mishnah says it that way. So we should maybe, going back, maybe we should be mentioning and explaining kinuyim first. So where it says like this: Halein, those cases mishum the abshulei, because there's so many cases mefar shahud the pasuk v'reisha. So we mention those first, because whenever you find that they're very, very lengthy, so then we we'll do the first one mentioned first. It says when it comes to an animal, that what can it go out with? What can go in aftsar? Can it go in mardas with a saddlebag, a feeding bag, or depending on the ring around its nose, whether you're allowed to have natirta yaterta, an extra amount of protection, or is that considered to be a masa? As the Gemara over there says, so it mentions that even though there's not so many details in that situation, so that can't be the reason. Ella, as we continue to Gimel Mud Aleph, lav dafka. The truth is that there's no real rhyme or reason. Zimna mefarish shahu the pasach bereisha, zimna nahu the salk bereisha, mefarish bereisha. So the Gemara just says that there is, and we're going to stop here, that there really is no necessarily rhyme or reason why things take place. That first one's explained. So therefore, you can't ask a kasha or Mishnah, because sometimes it is done that way, even though it's not always done that way, and there's no necessarily real reason why. To look at the Ran, the lake of Kapeda b'milsa, the whole Tana the Tani kideboy shapradami. However, they said it was fine. Lake b'hamilsa mishum v'tivchar lashon arumim. There's no real problem that it was done in this particular fashion. Okay, let's see, what did I write for question TA7? Ma hevdel bein neder l'shvua, ma sad shiyoyel neder b'lashon shvua. A neder is on the chayfet, shvua is on the gavra. Since your pev and lev are equal, it is no different than the koyach of yad. So a neder b'lashon shvua is chal. Okay, good answer. And TB8, we didn't do yet. Adkan.